Would you have fled or remained if your country was invaded? That decision was thrust into the hands of nearly every leader in Europe as Hitler's troops stormed across nation after nation. Hello and welcome to Moments in History. I'm Linda Shenton-Matchett, author, speaker, and history geek. While researching my stories, I unearthed tons of intriguing historical information that doesn't end up in my books, so I've created this channel to share those tidbits with you. Fortunately for King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, England was separated from the continent by the English Channel, which meant Hitler could not simply drive his tanks across the border. Instead, he sent bombers in an effort to bring the country to its knees and a subsequent surrender. The King and Queen had a different idea, however. They remained in London, staying at Buckingham Palace throughout the Blitz. Queen Elizabeth famously said after the palace was hit, "I'm glad we were bombed. It makes me feel I can look East End in the eye." To boost morale, they often visited areas damaged during bombing, including the East End, as well as traveling to military bases and munitions factories, with the king typically attired in his uniform. In 1943, he went to North Africa after the victory of El Alamein to address the troops, and on June 14, 1944, he visited his forces on the beaches of Normandy. Radio addresses were frequent, and he created the George Cross and the George Medal, two awards on par with the Victoria Cross, to recognize acts of bravery by civilians. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth didn't perform these acts to be popular, but the two monarchs became very well loved. They also opened their arms to the 10 governments in exile. Across the sea, the Scandinavian countries were holding on as best they could. To King Haakon VII's dismay, his troops fell and Normandy was invaded in April of 1940. He and his government refused to knuckle under and accept German demands. He stated he'd rather abdicate than appoint Vidkun Quisling prime minister. His legislature supported him, which resulted in repeated bombings by Germany. When the Allies withdrew in June of 1940, he fled to England on a British heavy cruiser. The Storing met and gave him and the government full authority to rule from afar for the war's duration. His refusal to abdicate became a powerful symbol to the Norwegian people, and he broadcast radio addresses to his people, encouraging them, as well as coordinating war efforts from England. In June 1944, Crown Prince Olav was appointed Chief of Defense by his father and took over leadership of the Norwegian Armed Forces. Olav's wife, Princess Martha, took their 3 children to her home country of Sweden, but by August she was getting pushback about remaining because authorities felt her presence put the country's neutrality in danger. President Roosevelt sent an army transport to pick her up from a Finnish port, and she arrived in the U.S. on August 28th, where she worked with the Red Cross and promoted Norwegian interests. King Gustav V of Sweden reigned from 1907 until his death in 1950. Upon England's declaration of war on September 1st, Sweden quickly announced its neutrality, and Gustav worked tirelessly to maintain that stance. Some scholars feel he compromised heavily to do so. He allowed German troops to travel through Sweden on many occasions after stating he would abdicate if the government did not support him with that decision. With a German wife, he may have been caught between a rock and a hard place, but his behaviors weren't surprising, as he had shown sympathy to Germany during World War I. Sweden continued to do business with Germany until 1943, when the tide turned to the Allies. Sweden softened their policy to accept refugees and eventually ceased relations with Germany. Sweden also allowed the construction of training camps for Norwegian soldiers, claiming the facilities were police training camps. An interesting aspect of Sweden's neutrality was the capital city of Stockholm. A hotbed of intrigue, the city was a gathering place for spies from nearly every combatant, to which the government alternately eavesdropped and turned a blind eye. The third Scandinavian country of Denmark was also occupied in April of 1940 despite its declaration of neutrality. But King Christian X refused to flee. He rode his horse daily through the streets of Copenhagen without a bodyguard. When asked about this, he stated, "The people are my bodyguards." He played a huge role in saving most of Denmark's Jewish population, refusing to mandate the registration of Jews and the wearing of yellow stars on their clothing. Interestingly, Germany did not push the Danes about either of these actions. The Danish government was left to operate as it had, and the army and navy allowed to remain active. One thing the German occupiers did do was control the country's foreign policy and set delivery quotas of raw materials and foodstuffs. Then came August 1943, when the Germans announced the deportation of Jews. A rescue mission was quickly organized, during which Jews were transported to the coast, then ferried into Sweden, saving more than 7,000 Jews and almost 700 non-Jewish relatives. The government completely footed the bill. Like many of its neighboring countries, the Netherlands declared its neutrality in September 1939, but subsequently fell in May of 1940, one day after the bombing of Rotterdam. 5 years of occupation began. The widowed Queen Wilhelmina and her children fled to London with the Dutch Parliament via train and then on the British destroyer HMS Hereward. Princess Juliana and her children evacuated to Canada for the remainder of the war. The government took a large portion of the country's gold and diamond reserves with them to England, but the Germans confiscated the remaining portion, which was never returned. Germany instituted martial law, but invited the royal family to return and govern under German control. Upon refusal by the Queen, the Germans tried using a velvet glove approach on the Dutch citizens, but eventually life became extremely difficult as the invaders demanded more and more from the Netherlanders in terms of money, produce, and labor. A civil administration was installed under Arthur Seyss-Inquart, an Austrian Nazi who would later be convicted as a war criminal. While in England, the Queen frequently broadcast over Radio Orange, encouraging Dutch residents. She had Prime Minister Dirk-Jan de Geer removed after he tried to open negotiations with Germany. Declaring itself neutral, Belgium quickly fell to the Germans also in May of 1940, and King Leopold III surrendered alongside his army. Prime Minister Herbert Perlot and the cabinet declared the act unconstitutional and fled to London, where a government in exile was formed. Operating as a tripartite with ministers from the Catholic, Liberal, and Labour parties, they administered the Belgian Congo and coordinated the Free Belgian Forces and the Belgian resistance. They officially held no authority. However, they performed negotiations with other Allied powers about post-war reconstruction and executed agreements that included the foundation of the Benelux Customs Union and Belgium's admissions to the United Nations. In Belgium, Leopold was put under house arrest and remained a prisoner of war for the rest of the conflict. In 1944, the family was moved to Germany, then Austria, before being liberated by the Americans. Until 1950, he was banned from returning to Belgium, where his brother, Prince Charles, was declared regent. Are you intrigued by these and other World War II topics? Consider picking up my book, The American World War II Homefront in 29 Objects, in which artifacts collected from across the nation tell the stories of the American people whose lives were shaped by this second war to end all wars, World War II. Thank you for watching and have a great rest of your day.